My brief acquaintanceship with Norman Mailer was set up by a curious series of events. 18 years old, I was a freshman at Antioch College, and one of the features I liked best, the feature I liked best at Antioch, was its work-study program. We didn't just work a little bit as a token to be able to tell ourselves we had. We actually worked a full 6 months of each year and studied 6 months of each year. A lot of us learned more from our work experiences than we did from most of our classes. My first work period was in the fall of 1967. I went off to Washington, D.C. to be a copyboy at the Washington Post. I'm sure it's all very different now. It's all computerized now. Maybe they don't even have copyboys. But we used to take bits of rough typing from one desk to another, to the national desk, to the foreign desk. Very rarely we would take messages of one sort or another to the offices of the main editors. We didn't get to meet them because they were buffered by secretaries. What's his name now? The guy with the leathery face, Ben Bradley. He was there, but I hardly ever saw him. Anyway, I would take bits of copy from one desk to another, pick up things. Some reporter would shout out, "Copy boy," and he would hold up a sheaf of papers. And one of us, there'd usually be 2 or 3 of us on duty at any one point, would pick up his stuff and take it to wherever he wanted taken. Or maybe he wanted a cup of coffee, or maybe he wanted his pencil sharpened or something. They treated us with varying degrees of condescension. And some of them, the younger reporters, treated us as equals. We had to wear a coat and tie for the job, and in that sense, we looked no different from anyone else, but we were younger. As I said, I was 18. Some of the young reporters were in their mid-20s, not fresh out of college. They might have had one journalism job before bouncing up to the big time. So one day after work, this was in late October, one of these young reporters asked me if I wanted to go out for a drink with him. There was a bar down the block that they often went to after work. He said, "I'm going down for a drink with a couple other reporters. Why don't you come along?" So I said, "Well, I'm underage. I can't get into a bar. They won't serve me." He said, "It doesn't matter. It's going to be dim in there, smoky. There's a stripper in there with these spotlights on her. The lighting on the people drinking is very bad. They won't be able to tell the difference, and they don't care. Come on with us. You can have a beer." So I went out to have a drink with this guy and a couple of his buddies. And 2 of them were filled with chatter about Norman Mailer, because Norman Mailer was in town, and the night before he had performed at the Ambassador Hotel with a number of other literary types. Robert Lowell, the poet, was the other major luminary, along with Norman Mailer, the author of The Naked and the Dead. I'd read The Naked and the Dead. It was a big, fat novel, and it was fairly dull, I thought. When they brought up the topic of Norman Mailer, I had to smile because, as it happened, I was reading one of Mailer's books at the time, one of his compendia of political diatribes that he had written for various magazines. So there were these 2 books that I knew of, Advertisements for Myself, which was a perfect title for Mailer. He admitted his narcissism, but did it with a sense of humor. This is who I am, but I'm joking about it, really. Advertisements for Myself. And the other one was called The Presidential Papers of Norman Mailer. And that one, as it happened, I had been reading, and I had it in my jacket pocket, but I didn't pull it out to refer to it to these 2 reporters because they were young guys with insecurities, just as I had, and I didn't want to show them up in any way. They were older, they had been to Yale, they hadn't gone to some quasi-communist college in Southwest Ohio. For whatever reason, maybe they hadn't read the presidential papers of Norman Mailer. But I did say, you know what Mailer calls you guys in the press? They didn't know. They sat back, watching, waiting, as the stripper stripped in the background. I think the song that was playing was A Whiter Shade of Pale by Procol Harum. That was a big hit in those days, and it was a good song to striptease dance to. I wasn't watching the stripper. I was watching these two guys. I said, he calls the press the goat. The goat, says one of these guys. What's that supposed to mean? And I said, well, basically that the press will take in all sorts of material. It'll eat anything. It doesn't discriminate. And then it throws out this result, the goat, the low order of beast in Norman Mailer's eyes. Well, it was a lot worse than that in Norman Mailer's eyes. If I'd felt like hauling out my copy of his tome, showing him in typical bulldog pose, I could have read to these two reporters. So they char the inside of their bodies in order to scrape up news which can go out to the machine, that enormous machine, that intellectual leviathan which is obliged to eat each day. Tidbits, gristle, gravel, garbage cans, Charlotte Russe, old rubber tires, T-bone steaks, wet cardboard, dry leaves, apple pie, broken bottles, dog food, shells, roach powder, dry ballpoint pens, grapefruit juice. All the trash, all the garbage, all the slop, and a little of the wealth go out each day and night into the belly of that old American goat, our newspapers. But that's not all. So the reporters smell also of this work. They smell of the dishwasher and the pots, their flesh burning themselves very quietly and slowly in the service of a machine which feeds the goat. One smells this collective odor on the instant one enters their meeting room. It is not a corrupt smell. It does not have enough of the meats, the savory, and the vitality of flesh to smell corrupt and fearful when it is bad. No, it is more the smell of excessive respect for power, the odor of flesh gutted by avidities which are electric and empty. And even that isn't all. He goes on and on. A long, long half-page paragraph continues from there. Norman Mailer is not a man of a few words. But all I said to these guys in the strip bar that evening was, he called the press the goat. That was enough showing off for me. I was pleased that they let me accompany them to this place and drink underage with them, watch the stripper. But what was even more interesting to watch were the tables of working men who were sitting closer to the stage and were more involved in what the dancer was doing. These were guys in bib overalls who were all eyes for the show, but weren't speaking. They were talking to each other in sign language, very descriptive sign language and very enthusiastic, going on about the dancer on the stage and how great she was. They were having a terrific time. And there wasn't just one table of these guys. There were several tables. They would talk back and forth, table to table, because they didn't have to be heard. They could talk in sign language clear across the room. I said, who are those guys? And one of the reporters said, they're linotype operators. The linotype room is so loud from all the machinery that they hire only deaf people. If you weren't deaf when you started, the room would drive you to deafness. It would make you deaf unless you wore plugs in your ears all the time. So it's best just to hire deaf people for that room. So they were part of the newspaper too. Part of Norman Mailer's goat. Norman Mailer with this persona of the performer, the boxer. He liked to think he was a boxer because he was a Hemingway type. He really studied Hemingway and was going to out Hemingway if he could. He spoke of Hemingway constantly in his writing. He adulated Hemingway, it was clear. And he was just a little guy himself, Norman Mailer, a little Jewish guy from Brooklyn. Hemingway, by contrast, was this big, brash bully from the Midwest, Protestant background, more than a little anti-Semitic, which you would think might have turned down Mailer's ardor for him somewhat. He wanted to beat up a lot of people, Ernest Hemingway, although I didn't see him quite that way yet. I kind of adulated him myself. 2 reporters at my table had been at the Ambassador to hear Mailer speak. He was very drunk, they agreed. He could barely speak. He could barely articulate his high ideas. He had talked about having to take a leak and considered the idea of doing it on stage. He had embarrassed the other people who were on stage, Robert Lowell included. These guys were discussing what a fool Mailer had appeared to be. They were speculating as to how he would perform at the Pentagon on the 21st, which was coming up. First, there was to be a peace march to the Lincoln Memorial, where speeches would be given. Nice musicians would sing songs. Peter, Paul, and Mary were supposed to be there. Joan Baez would be there. And then the people who were more into a higher grade or lower grade of demonstration were going to march across to the Pentagon and assemble in front of the Pentagon and demonstrate there. And maybe there would be physical confrontation there. There would be troops there for sure. LBJ had pledged he would have plenty of troops in Washington that day, federal troops, to protect the public institutions, protect democracy against the rabble, and so on. This was still mid-67, and the public opposition to the war hadn't coalesced entirely yet. Robert McNamara was still the defense secretary. He'd be working in his office pretending everything was normal. That afternoon, that people were going to assemble in front of the Pentagon. Allen Ginsberg, the poet, had announced that he was going to be part of the demonstration. In fact, in his Zen mystic mastery, he and some friends were going to levitate the Pentagon, a fairly large building withal. So I listened mostly. I drank my beer. I did not get drunk. I listened to these young reporters talk about Norman Mailer and filed this away in my mind because I knew nothing about Norman Mailer in those days. I suppose he had stabbed his wife, his Hispanic wife of many wives, but this was maybe wife number 2, I think. He'd had a cocktail party in his apartment. There'd been liquor flowing freely. He and his wife had gotten terribly drunk. He had upset her, and along about 4 or 5 in the morning, she had called him a faggot, which was, she knew, a surefire way of making him furious, challenging his manhood. Little Norman didn't like his manhood being challenged, and he would punch you in the nose if you challenged it, because he knew how Hemingway dealt with such people, and he dealt with them the same way, only more so because he was a little guy, and he had more of a chip on his shoulder. So he didn't punch her in the nose that night, but he did pick up a penknife of some sort, or letter opener or something, and he stabbed her 1/2 inch from her heart, nearly killed her. She had to be rushed off to the hospital. Later on, she wouldn't press charges against him, so he didn't go to prison for this attack. He was put in Bellevue Hospital for a couple of weeks to undergo observation, because he was clearly out of his mind, but they sobered him up and let him loose on the public again. Norman Mailer loved violence, and when I got arrested at the Pentagon demonstration, outside the Pentagon, on the 21st of October, late at night, along about midnight, I had noticed that among the demonstrators around me, almost none were violent. Some had violent things to say or chant, such as, "Hey, hey, LBJ, how many kids did you kill today?" Things like that. cute things they like to chant. I didn't take part in that chanting. It seemed paradoxical to me that we were there on a peace mission, for a peace demonstration. Why chant violent things? Why sink to their level? I had registered for the draft some months earlier as a conscientious objector. I was learning gradually about pacifism and would continue to learn about pacifism in the decades to come. It would make more and more sense to me as a way of dealing with the endemic violence in America. I didn't chant, hey, hey, LBJ. How many kids did you kill today? I didn't join the SDS. I wasn't part of their contingent at the demonstration. But I was arrested with lots of these other characters. There's something like 600 or 800 of us arrested that night. And we were carted off to a county workhouse, a very low-level, minimum security jail, in a location called Occoquan, Virginia. It's a big place, and we were put in these large rooms, 100 people to a room. And there we slept that night of October 21st, 22nd. First, of course, we had to decompress. We were all excited after having been arrested at the Pentagon. We'd been knocked around a little bit. I'd had my shins whacked with billy clubs. But anyway, we calmed down sometime around 1 or 2 in the morning. We young prisoners, almost everyone there was a college kid, it seemed, and went to sleep. Next morning, they woke us up for breakfast around 7 o'clock. Breakfast was some sort of breakfast cereal and orange juice, bad coffee. But we gloried in the low quality of the food. We gloried in the narrowness of the cots we slept on. It was great. We were part of the cause, the opposition. And various of us, after getting dressed, we'd slept in or out of our clothes, wandered aimlessly around this large room, looking each other over, smoking cigarettes, sharing cigarettes, talking about smoking dope, if that was a big deal. No one had any dope to smoke there, I don't think, but that was the kind of talk that went around in those days. In fact, there were reporters in the newsroom of the Washington Post. One reporter came up to me one day, not long before I went out to the bar with these other guys, and said, "What's it like to get high on dope?" A reporter asked me this. I was just a kid there, just a copyboy. But he knew I went to Antioch, and it was assumed that everyone who went to Antioch was stoned all the time. And he said, "You're stoned now, right?" And I said, "I am not. What's more, I hardly ever get stoned. I don't like being stoned. I don't like smoking grass." He said, "You're not serious." He was very let down with me. I said, "No, I don't enjoy it. I've tried it, but I stay away from it mostly because it makes me feel insecure and I lose my memory." I was watching Walter Cronkite one night on the news, and there was this girl watching with me, and then we tried talking about something Walter Cronkite had said in the news. She was smoking a joint, and she'd shared it with me. I was stoned. She asked me some question about the news from Vietnam. I started to answer her. I couldn't remember how the sentence had started by the time I got to the middle of it, so I couldn't finish it, and I couldn't think. I couldn't remember anything. I was stoned, all right, but I had no memory. And I sat there for the rest of the Walter Cronkite news hour, thinking to myself, what am I going to do with the rest of my life if I don't have any memory? What kind of job am I going to get? And he said to me, "You didn't. You're making this up." I said, "No, on my honor." So reporters all thought I was stoned there, but I wasn't. And I wasn't stoned at the Pentagon demonstration. And I didn't join in with this palaver about getting stoned because people who got stoned a lot didn't particularly impress me at that point. I liked getting drunk. I shared that weakness with Norman Mailer, but I didn't get as monumentally stupendously drunk, as he seemed to, according to these reporters. So I was walking around this big room, looking people over. And off to one side, kind of by himself, was this one guy lying on his cot, still lying there. He didn't seem to be in a mood to get up. He had his arm over his eyes. He's lying there in his underpants, t-shirt. It all appeared kind of gray, but then just about everything in the room seemed kind of gray. There was a pall of cigarette smoke, but he seemed gray. His pallor seemed gray as he pulled his hand back from his eyes. This middle-aged guy. He wasn't young like the rest of us. He was older. I took a closer look, and he seemed to look like this character, whose face and belligerent pose were on both sides of this book I was reading at the time. And I knew that we were brothers in this together, all of us. And any one of us was tacitly pledged to any other one of us to speak to him if addressed, because we were in the same struggle together. So after he drew his hand off his eyes were still closed, I said to him, "Excuse me, but aren't you Norman Mailer?" He looked up at me and he said, "Yes, I am." And we carried on a conversation for some minutes. He stayed in bed for the conversation. He didn't rise, but he looked at me in his exhausted way. I was thinking to myself, man, are you hungover? You must have arrived drunk at the demonstration. He looked terrible. His t-shirt, his underpants looked gray, his skin looked gray. He was looking out at the world with a kind of dejection, I would have said. He wasn't all poised to spring at people. Although in his book, The Armies of the Night, he claimed he was. He claimed he was wondering how long it'd be till he got in a big fist fight with someone. Even in jail with the rest of us peaceniks, he was wondering how long it would take him before he could clear his system by having a good fight. Well, I didn't bother him about Vietnam, which was just as well, because he didn't seem to be, in his book, he didn't seem to be impressed by people who were against violence. He was most impressed by SDS types who wanted to beat up the ones who were beating up the little Asians in Vietnam, the ones who'd risen to the bait of Lyndon Johnson and Robert McNamara and the other big bullies in Washington. Norman was a bully too, but he was a little bully, but not with me. He was exhausted. I asked him about the mayoralty of New York City. Funny enough, Lindsay had been elected, and there had been 3 candidates: John Lindsay, Abraham Beame, the Democratic nominee, and the third was William F. Buckley. Old lizard lips. Buckley was the one Mailer admired. They were antagonists. He liked duking it out with Buckley on TV shows like the Dick Cavett Show. He'd had a debate with Buckley, I believe in Chicago at some point, and he wanted to talk about that, about how he had taken Buckley out in the 3rd round. He sort of came to life a little bit when he talked about William F. Buckley. But clearly, he wasn't impressed with my conversation. He didn't want to talk with me. I wasn't for torching the Pentagon and the White House and all of this high-flown talk of the SDS characters. Kill the pigs. But he was minimally polite because I had, after all, been arrested with him and Allen Ginsberg and the others. So he had to show a modicum of respect for me, and then we parted. That was the extent of my face-to-face relationship with the man in the underwear, Norman Mailer. It did not get any more intimate than that. But when Norman Mailer's book came out, The Armies of the Night, and was on the stands at pharmacies and places around the country where celebrity items were for sale, I took it off the shelf and leafed through till I found the part where I should have appeared in it. I did not appear. It seemed to me he had written about a different demonstration entirely than the one I had attended. Hey, you Norman Mailer? Asked one rangy prisoner, grabbing his arm. There was a roller coaster in the boy's eye, a big yahoo tone. He had obviously been in some action. He was still cocked on whatever he had taken. Yeah, says Norman Mailer. We gotta talk. The grip deepened. The eye was red. He threw off the arm. When the time comes, buddy. Through stale sweat and all rancid prison air, I didn't notice any prison air being rancid, he could feel adrenaline coming again. This is Norman talking about himself, which is mostly what this book is. Half the kids who had just arrived would be his admirers. For want of a live Hemingway, he would be expected to serve as the poor man's papa. If half of these kids proved to be admiring, they would certainly be the sort who couldn't bear an admiration until they had had a fight with it. If the admiration won, they could admire it even more. If it lost, they would be sad. Yes, Mailer decided, on the basis of past experience, there was one good chance in 3 or 4 he would be in a real fight before dark. That would certainly help him to get out. Yes, it would. He would get out of the dormitory and into isolation. And so on. That's pretty much the whole book. It wasn't the demonstration I attended, and it wasn't the guys in the dormitory that I ran into. But it was the little guy in the underwear, although he didn't punch me. But then I wasn't looking for his Hemingway or for mine either.